the fatal mistake in this case. Sources with direct knowledge tell us a month before the murders, doctors changed the meds Nick was taking for schizoaffective disorder.
The first thing to understand about Nick Reiner is this. What happened in 2020 quietly changed the direction of everything that came after, and almost no one noticed it at the time. According to publicly available records and reporting by the New York Times, Nick Reiner was placed into a mental health conservatorship for 1 year. No headlines, no public explanation, just a legal decision that briefly removed his ability to make certain choices for himself. And here's the part that raises questions. That conservatorship ended in 2021, and it was never renewed. What followed wasn't sudden. It was gradual, complicated, and, according to experts, shaped by decisions that rarely get discussed outside of medical charts. To understand how this story unfolded, you have to start there, not at the end. The conservatorship few people noticed in 2020. Nick Reiner was placed under what's known as an LPS, conservatorship, short for Lanterman-Petris-Short. This isn't the same type of conservatorship that's often discussed in celebrity news. An LPS conservatorship is typically initiated by medical professionals and usually follows an involuntary psychiatric hospitalization. Its purpose, at least on paper, is stabilization, not punishment, not control, but treatment during a period when someone is considered unable to safely manage their own care. According to court records cited by the New York Times, Nick's conservatorship lasted the standard 1 year term. It expired in 2021. Why it wasn't extended has never been publicly explained, and that silence matters, because what happens after a conservatorship ends can be just as important as why it started. What the records actually say. The reporting around Nick's conservatorship is careful, and LIMITEDA licensed fiduciary Stephen Baer confirmed that Nick was under conservatorship. A clerk from the Los Angeles County Superior Court confirmed the dates, but beyond that, there were no details released about treatment plans, daily oversight, or what benchmarks were used to decide the conservatorship should end. All we know is this: by 2021, Nick was no longer legally under structured supervision, and from there, responsibility shifted back to outpatient care, medication management, and family support. That transition is where many experts say outcomes can quietly change. A diagnosis that explains, but doesn't simplify around the same period. Sources familiar with Nick's medical history say he was diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder. It's a condition that can include symptoms affecting mood, perception, and thought processes, but it doesn't follow a single pattern. Some people respond well to treatment for years. Others experience instability during medication changes. What's important here is context. A diagnosis alone doesn't determine outcomes. Treatment consistency often does, and according to sources, Nick was stable for a period of time. When treatment works, until it doesn't in the months leading up to late 2020. Nick was reportedly taking medication that was effective in controlling symptoms. However, those same medications came with side effects, including significant weight gain. This is not unusual. Many antipsychotic medications are known to affect metabolism, appetite, and energy levels. According to sources cited in later reporting, Nick raised concerns about these changes with his doctors. That moment, the complaint, becomes a critical turning point, because shortly after, his medication regimen was changed. The risk few people talk about. Medication adjustments in psychiatric care are common, but they are also one of the most sensitive phases of treatment. Doctors aim to balance symptom control with quality of life. Sometimes that works smoothly, other times, according to clinicians, even well-intended changes can lead to destabilization, especially if the original medication was effective. Sources say that after the change, Nick's behavior began to shift, not overnight, not dramatically at first, but gradually enough that those close to him noticed something was off. The window that closed quietly. This is where the timeline becomes unsettling, not because of spectacle, but because of how ordinary it looks on paper. No conservatorship, a recent medication change, a known history of severe mental illness. According to later statements, Nick's condition deteriorated in the weeks that followed, and yet, from the outside, there were no emergency interventions, no renewed legal oversight, no public alarms. Just a narrowing window where stability was slipping. And this is where outside voices begin to weigh in, offering interpretations that would later spark debate, controversy, and uncomfortable questions about how mental health systems respond after formal oversight ends. Because one doctor, in particular, would later suggest that something else might have been happening beneath the surface. But that claim, and what it implies, changes how this entire story is viewed. When outside opinions enter the storyos, the public began learning more about Nick Reiner's mental health history. Some commentators started asking a different kind of question. Not what happened, but why the deterioration appeared so sudden. One of the most widely discussed opinions came from Dr. Drew Pinsky, who spoke publicly about the case while emphasizing that he had no direct involvement in Nick's treatment. Dr. Drew was careful to frame his comments as interpretation, not diagnosis, based on publicly reported details and his professional experience. Still, his perspective added a new layer to the conversation, a controversial interpretation with protective language airing a televised discussion. Dr. Drew suggested that the nature of the reported behavior did not, in his view, align solely with medication destabilization. He stated that, based on his experience, certain patterns he observed were consistent with stimulant-related psychosis, specifically mentioning methamphetamine as a possibility. Importantly, this was presented as speculation, not an allegation, not a confirmed finding, and not supported by publicly released toxicology results. Dr. Drew himself acknowledged the limits of what could be known without direct evidence. But once the idea entered public discourse, it shifted how many people interpreted the timeline. Why that claim gained traction. The reason Dr. Drew's comments resonated with some viewers wasn't sensationalism, it was familiarity. Clinicians often distinguish between psychotic episodes caused by long-term mental illness and those triggered or intensified by substances. According to psychiatric literature, stimulant-induced psychosis can sometimes appear abruptly, escalate quickly, and present with intense disorganization. Dr. Drew pointed to what he described as the severity of the reported breakdown. As part of his reasoning, again, this was framed as a hypothesis, not a conclusion, but it raised a question that hadn't been publicly discussed before. A location, timing, and interpretation are detailed that fueled speculation. Was where Nick was arrested. Public reports state he was taken into custody in the Exposition Park area of Los Angeles, not far from USC and south of downtown. Parts of that neighborhood, like many dense urban areas, have a documented history of drug-related activity alongside residential communities, schools, and cultural institutions. Dr. Drew referenced this context while emphasizing that location alone proves nothing. Still, in public discussion, it became another data point layered onto an already complex picture. What we know and what we don't. There is where responsible analysis matters. There has been no public confirmation that Nick Reiner used illegal substances. No toxicology report has been released. No official statement has supported or denied Dr. Drew's speculation. What has been consistently reported is this: Nick had a serious, diagnosed mental illness, experienced a medication change shortly before his condition worsened. This prior medication regimen had been effective. Despite side effects, those facts are not disputed. The rest exists in a space of interpretation, not certainty. The medication question reads ironically. Dr. Drew also emphasized something else, something far less controversial. He stated that abrupt changes to psychiatric medication, especially when a patient has been stable, can be dangerous. In Nick's case, sources say he was stable until roughly a month before the incident. When he raised concerns about weight gain, doctors adjusted his medication, and according to people familiar with the situation, the new combination did not have the same stabilizing effect, whether substances were involved or not. This part of the story remains central. A missed conversation in modern psychiatry. Drew also pointed to a growing trend in psychiatric care, addressing medication side effects without removing the medication itself. In recent years, some psychiatrists have explored prescribing weight management drugs, such as GLP-1 agonists, to counteract metabolic side effects from antipsychotics. These medications are better known for treating diabetes or aiding weight loss, but their off-label use in psychiatric care has been discussed in clinical circles. Dr. Drew suggested that, in theory, this approach might have preserved stability while addressing Nick's concerns. There is no claim that this option was discussed or denied in Nick's case. It remains a hypothetical, but a revealing one. When stability depends on FIMAR against this is the uncomfortable reality of severe mental illness treatment. Sometimes stability depends on a narrow margin. Change the dose, change the medication, change the environment, and the outcome can shift dramatically. According to sources, by the time Nick's condition had significantly deteriorated, he was experiencing a profound break from reality. Again, these descriptions come from secondhand accounts, not clinical records, but they underscore how quickly situations can escalate once destabilization begins. And yet, even with all these explanations, medication, diagnosis, speculation, and hindsight, there's still a larger question that doesn't get enough attention, because this wasn't just about one medical decision. It was about what happens after formal oversight ends, when responsibility is fragmented and warning signs don't always trigger intervention. That question becomes impossible to ignore when we look at how the legal system entered the story. Next, when the legal system steps in, once the situation moved into the legal system, the narrative changed, not emotionally, but structurally. Nick Reiner was taken into custody and formally charged in connection with the deaths of his parents, Rob and Michelle Reiner. From that moment forward, everything slowed down, not because the case lacked importance, but because cases involving severe mental illness follow a different procedural path, one that prioritizes competency, evaluation, and due process over speed. Public records show that Nick's arraignment was delayed, in part due to developments within his legal defense team. This delay wasn't unusual. In cases like this, courts often pause proceedings to ensure the accused can meaningfully participate in their own defense. Competency comes before conclusion. One of the least understood aspects of cases involving mental illness is competency to stand trial. This isn't about guilt or innocence. It's about whether a person understands the charges against them and can assist their attorney when there is reason to doubt that capacity. The court must intervene, often ordering evaluations or treatment, before proceedings can continue. Given Nick's documented psychiatric history, this step was not unexpected. But for the public, it added another layer of uncertainty, because it delayed answers and extended the period where speculation filled the silence. Why public narratives often oversimplify at this stage. Many stories begin to collapse into extremes. Either mental illness becomes the entire explanation, or it's dismissed as irrelevant in favor of more sensational theories. Both approaches miss the point. Mental illness does not operate in isolation. It interacts with medication, environment, support systems, and timing. And in Nick's case, there were multiple systems involved: medical care, legal oversight, family responsibility, and, briefly, a conservatorship that had already ended. One played a role, not independently, but collectively. The conservatorship question returns as the case gained attention. People began asking a question that had largely gone unexamined. Should the conservatorship have been renewed? There is no public evidence that legal criteria for renewal were met. There is also no public explanation for why it ended when it did. Under California law, LPS conservatorships are not meant to be permanent. They are reviewed annually and require clear justification to continue. In other words, the system is designed to restore autonomy whenever possible. But autonomy without sufficient support can create vulnerability, especially during treatment transitions. That tension sits at the center of this case, a system built for moments. Not Morgan's mental health systems are often designed to respond to crises, hospitalizations, emergency holds. Court orders. But what happens in between those moments? During medication adjustments, after legal oversight ends, where warning signs are ambiguous, is far less structured. Nick's situation appears to have existed in that gray area: stable, then unstable, supported, then less so. Observed, then trusted, not because anyone intended harm, but because systems rarely account for how fragile stability can be. Why hindsight feels so sharp in retrospect. Every decision feels heavier. The medication change, the end of the conservatorship, the absence of renewed intervention. But hindsight has an advantage reality never does: clarity after the fact. At the time, each step likely appeared reasonable on its own. That's what makes these cases so difficult to process for families, professionals, and the public alike. What this case is really about, despite the headlines, this story isn't primarily about crime. It's about thresholds. How much instability is enough to trigger action? When does concern become intervention? And who decides? Doctors, courts, families, or patients themselves? Nick Reiner's case sits at the intersection of all three. And that intersection is where systems are most likely to fail quietly, because no matter how this legal case ultimately resolves, it leaves behind a larger issue, one that extends far beyond a single family or diagnosis. A question about whether our mental health frameworks are built for long-term reality or only for emergencies, and that question doesn't end here. When people look back on cases like this, there's often an instinct to search for a single turning point, one decision, one moment, one mistake, but this story doesn't really work that way. What happened to Nick Reiner unfolded across years, not days, across systems, not individuals, and across a series of reasonable decisions that, when combined, created unintended consequences. That's what makes it difficult and important to talk about. Understanding, without simplifying, mental health conservatorships exist to protect people during periods when they can't protect themselves. Medication exists to restore balance when symptoms interfere with daily life. Legal safeguards exist to ensure fairness when someone enters the justice system with serious psychiatric needs. In this case, all three systems were involved, just not always at the same time, and the gaps between them are where uncertainty grows. Why this case rests. Nick Reiner's story resonates not because it's rare, but because it exposes a reality many families quietly face. Stability can depend on very small margins, a medication change, a missed appointment, an assumption that things are good enough to step back. None of these choices are reckless on their own, but together, they raise questions about how we define readiness, recovery, and responsibility. What we're left with, there are no simple answers here, not for clinicians, not for courts, not for families trying to do the right thing under immense pressure. What remains is a need for better conversations about how mental health care continues after crisis intervention ends, and how support systems adapt when legal oversight is removed. Those conversations are still evolving. Looking ahead, in the next video, we'll take a closer look at how LPS conservatorships actually work, what criteria are used to end them, and why renewal is often more complicated than people realize. Not to assign blame, but to understand the structure that shaped this case long before it entered public view. If you want to follow that deeper breakdown, you'll find it there. Understanding cases like this isn't about shock or judgment. It's about recognizing how fragile balance can be and how important it is to design systems that don't just respond to emergencies, but support people through the quieter, more uncertain moments in between.